A commercial aircraft belonging to the airline India Express, a Boeing 737-800, was preparing to land at Mangalore International Airport. On board were 166 people, most of them Indian nationals, returning home after a stay in Dubai. Flight 812 had proceeded normally for nearly its entire duration. It was a regular route, typically uneventful. But what happened in the final moments turned a routine operation into one of the worst aviation disasters in India's history. The destination airport, located in the coastal city of Mangalore, has an unusual layout. Its runway is built on a narrow, elevated plateau with steep drop-offs at both ends. This kind of setup, known as a tabletop runway, demands absolute precision and skill from the pilots. Due to the complexity involved, India's civil aviation authorities had mandated that only the captain was allowed to perform takeoffs and landings at this airport. The aircraft assigned to this operation was a Boeing 737-800, registration VTAXV, specially equipped to handle short runways like the one in Mangalore. Manufactured in 2008, this aircraft was part of the Air India Express fleet, a low-cost subsidiary established in 2005 to operate short-haul international routes, primarily to destinations in the Gulf and Southeast Asia. At the time, the airline operated around 20 similar aircraft, and many of its flights were crewed by a mix of foreign captains and Indian first officers. The captain on this flight was a 55-year-old pilot with dual Serbian and British citizenship, boasting over 10,000 flight hours of experience. In the co-pilot seat was a 40-year-old Indian first officer with a spotless professional record and over 3,600 hours of flight time. The two were expected to work together to ensure the safety of the operation, but fatigue and a series of questionable decisions would soon upset that balance. At 1:06 a.m., the plane took off from Dubai Airport without incident. The route took it over the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, heading toward India's southwestern coast. Inside the aircraft, all was calm. Most of the passengers were asleep, but in the cockpit, a troubling sign went unnoticed. The captain reclined his seat and drifted into a deep sleep. Later, the cockpit voice recorder would reveal that the captain had been in a deep sleep for much of the flight. For over an hour and a half, the first officer handled all communications with air traffic control and monitored the flight entirely on his own. After more than 3 hours in the air, the first officer contacted air traffic controllers at Mangalore Airport. Weather conditions were good, clear skies and decent visibility. But there was a major issue. The airport's ground radar had been out of service for 2 days, forcing the crew to operate without a key navigational aid for landing. Faced with that situation, the first officer showed signs of uncertainty. "Radar is not available. I'm not sure what to do," he said aloud. The captain, newly awake and not yet wearing his headset, offered no response. A few minutes later, at 5:41 a.m., the crew conducted a pre-landing briefing, a standard safety procedure. However, this critical phase was handled in a rushed and superficial manner. Minimum approach criteria weren't discussed, the proper descent profile wasn't reviewed, and the airport's unique features were overlooked entirely. It was a serious omission. The approach began unusually. Instead of initiating descent at a safe distance, typically around 240 kilometers from the airport, they started descending just 148 kilometers from the destination. This forced the aircraft to lose altitude much more aggressively than recommended. Mangalore Airport leaves no room for error. Perched atop a narrow plateau, it's flanked by steep drop-offs at both ends of the runway. Every approach requires pinpoint precision with no margin for last-minute corrections. At 5:59 a.m., the captain took manual control of the aircraft. Although he was awake, it was evident he hadn't fully regained his clarity. In an effort to descend more quickly, he deployed the landing gear and extended the speed brakes. Even so, the aircraft was still flying too high. At that point, the descent rate exceeded 3,000 feet per minute, a dangerously steep rate for an active landing. Alarmed by what he saw through the windshield, the first officer voiced his concern. "We're too high. The runway is right there below us." The captain acknowledged the issue, though with a tone of resignation. "Oh, yes, we are high." In a situation like this, the proper course of action was to initiate a missed approach, abort the landing, climb, and attempt it again. But the captain didn't. Instead, he disengaged the autopilot and chose to continue the descent manually, even though the conditions were clearly unsafe. The aircraft's terrain awareness and warning system began sounding alarms. The first officer, increasingly alarmed, urged the captain to abort the landing. "Go around, Captain. This approach is not stable." Even the control tower, noticing something unusual, radioed in to confirm if everything was under control. The captain, fully aware it wasn't, replied firmly, "Affirmative." Despite all the warnings, the aircraft continued its descent. It crossed the threshold of runway 24 at a speed of 160 knots, well above the recommended limit, and still far too high for a safe landing. The aircraft touched down awkwardly, with only one rear wheel making contact, causing it to bounce. The first officer once again urged a go-around, but the captain persisted. The plane finally settled onto the runway much too late, leaving just 850 meters of tarmac remaining, far too little to stop safely at that speed. Although the auto brakes and thrust reversers were activated, the brakes were set to a medium mode, and full manual braking was never applied. The first officer warned they wouldn't be able to stop in time, and he was right. In a desperate and improper move, the captain attempted to take off again after deploying the reversers, a maneuver strictly prohibited. The aircraft failed to gain enough speed and overran the runway, striking an antenna and losing control. Seconds later, the plane plunged off the edge of the plateau, nosediving down a ravine over 50 meters deep. During the fall, it crossed a rural road, slammed into a hillside covered in vegetation, and broke into 3 large sections. Upon impact, the aircraft exploded and was quickly engulfed in flames. Despite the violent crash, 8 passengers managed to escape, some suffering severe burns. The rest were trapped inside, caught between the fire and the mangled fuselage. Within minutes, the interior was consumed by the blaze. Out of the 166 people on board, 158 lost their lives. Airport emergency crews were the first to respond, but the main wreckage lay more than 200 meters down a steep slope, making access extremely difficult. Over 100 rescue workers were mobilized, but the rugged terrain, thick smoke, and crowds of onlookers further complicated the efforts. The first to arrive at the crash site weren't emergency responders, but villagers from the nearby settlements. Many of them climbed down the steep hillside barefoot, using makeshift torches, desperately trying to rescue survivors through thick smoke and flames. A young girl was found alive, but tragically died on the way to the hospital. Though early reports mentioned 9 survivors, it was soon confirmed that only 8 people had made it out alive. The rest, trapped by seatbelts or disoriented by the fire, had no chance to escape. The scene was devastating. More than 70 passengers were burned beyond recognition, while others died on impact. All bodies were recovered by the end of the day, but for the families, the grief was just beginning. Counseling centers were set up, and several regions across India declared official days of mourning. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the entire country. The investigation began immediately. The most shocking discovery was the cockpit audio recording. Over 90 minutes of snoring, confirming that the captain had been in a deep sleep for most of the flight. Upon waking, still groggy and possibly unwell, he made a series of rushed decisions without proper coordination with the first officer. There was no proper pre-landing briefing, and the approach was initiated from too short a distance, partly due to the airport's radar being out of service. Despite repeated warnings from the first officer, the captain insisted on continuing the landing. With a flawed trajectory, excessive speed, and without applying maximum braking, the aircraft was unable to stop and overran the runway. In a final, desperate move, the captain attempted a go-around after reverse thrust had already been engaged, a maneuver forbidden under those conditions, resulting in total loss of control. The accident exposed critical failures, human error, technical limitations, and systemic organizational shortcomings. It left a lasting scar in the history of Indian aviation.